is Sarah, and the title of this video is She's Gone Mad. It is a Draw My Lifestyle video that tells the story of my immigration experience and the intersection between that and Toronto's mental health system. I believe that Toronto's current mental health system fails refugees and does more harm than good. This video will focus on the many ways that mental illness, madness, systemic racism, and newcomers to Canada, specifically racialized refugees, intersect. So, let's start from the beginning. I was born in Cali, Colombia, to a warm and loving family that consisted of my young single mother and her two parents, my grandparents. We lived in a lower middle class neighborhood, which to me was beautiful and surrounded by warmth, friends, caretakers in the forms of teachers, the school principal, neighbors, music, food, just so much vibrance. But if your classic lower middle class Torontonian was now placed in the neighborhood I grew up in, they would likely see it as poor and dangerous. Point is that yes, we lived in poverty, but I rarely ever felt unsafe due to the abundance of care and love that were given to me by the people around me. My mom has always said that it takes a village to raise a child, and I feel very fortunate to have been raised by a village. Fast forward to the age of 9 and life wasn't looking as bright. My grandmother died, which sent my mom into a deep depression followed by paranoid thoughts. She had a really bad relationship with my grandfather ever since she got pregnant at a young age, and she was scared he was going to kill her. She was struggling to keep herself alive, let alone take care of me. Despite many attempts, she could not make it through university, which meant she never had anything more than low-paying jobs that left her stressed and with much financial strain. She felt like a failure in every aspect of her life, and in the middle of a university lecture, she was forcibly sedated and taken to a mental health hospital per my grandfather's and uncle's request. Despite all of this, I still had a huge support system and was thriving in school. I was part of the dance team in school and was a happy kid. A village was still behind me. But at around this age, after my mom got out of the hospital, she started planting a seed in my head about moving to Canada to live with my dad and stepmom. I had only met my dad and stepmom several times during my childhood, but my mom felt it was important for me to connect with them, and also I would get to see the snow for the very first time, and penguins and beavers, and it would be like a vacation. So I agreed and hopped on a plane to move to Canada. I was actually talking to my mom about this recently, and she mentioned how confident and put together I was before going on the plane. I had all my paperwork with me and was very on top of things. She said she looked at me then, at the age of 10, and saw a grown-up, far more mature than she had ever been. I actually looked at the pictures recently and very much saw a child. Then I bawled my eyes out for a good hour. Moving on, all that confidence that I stepped into and out of that plane with was slowly shattered as my life in Canada unfolded. I arrived on a Friday morning, late in August, and on the Monday I had to attend my first day of grade 6 in a school and neighborhood that was and still is overwhelmingly white. I did not speak a word of English. My transition from life in Colombia to life in Canada was marked by a deep sense of alienation, loneliness, and a loss of connection to my community and myself. For me, school was the largest shock of all. I was bullied relentlessly, particularly about my accent, felt alienated, and was constantly subjected to microaggressions by my teachers and peers. I was the only ESL kid in school, thus felt very alone and lost in my experiences. This grew to the point where, through internalizing the actions of others, I began to experience self-loathing and suicidal thoughts. I was bullied so badly due to my differences that I quickly began to believe that everything that was wrong with me was due to my Colombian heritage. One time in English class, my teacher handed out an article for us to read. I don't remember the purpose, but I think we had to look at the grammar in the article. But this article was about the cocaine crisis in Colombia. From that moment on, all of my classmates would ask me if I had done cocaine, if my parents were addicted, if my family back home was part of the mafia, and many other things. I also remember being asked to stand in front of the class and read a book, but I couldn't get a sentence in before everyone started laughing because I struggled to pronounce many words. Those are just a few examples of the racism I experienced, and I thought I was so stupid that I began to bury my culture and the Latina in me as a survival mechanism in order to assimilate. Anything that made me stand out had to go. By the age of 11, I wanted to die. No child, irrespective of any factor, should ever have to go through this, and it is deeply troubling that not one educator, school counselor, or a social worker attempted to protect or support me, but in fact contributed to the disturbing racism. This is hard to talk about, so I'm gonna keep messing up, okay? Let's just acknowledge it and roll with it. Thank you. Eventually, by grade 8, I lost my accent. My name became Sarah, and I learned to fit in. But I lost who I was, and I didn't feel like myself. I felt like a fraud. By hiding my past and the things that made me happy from friends and peers, like the traditional Colombian music I used to dance to regularly, I felt like I was living a lie, even though I was no longer bullied too much. I ended up going to a very white high school, a typical school of the arts. My first day of high school actually was 2 weeks later than everyone else's. In the summer of grade 8, I had my first trip back to Colombia since moving to Canada. It was a really confusing and emotional time for me, and to make matters worse, my flight was canceled and delayed, so I missed the first 2 weeks of high school. And when I had my first day, my teacher introduced me as the Colombian student. I think that sets the tone for what ESA was like for me. By 16, I was the most suicidal I have ever been and actually had a plan to kill myself. I'd had it with the white supremacy, extreme assimilation as a survival mechanism, the invasive yearning for belonging, the loss of my family and culture, and so much more. I eventually ended up at CAMH, the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, where I was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and put on an antipsychotic medication. I remember one time going into the office of the psychiatrist who made these decisions about my health and telling her that I had had a panic attack on the streetcar on the way there. She asked me why, and I told her about how I had fought with my boyfriend earlier that day because I made a joke about white people to him, and he got really offended. She then proceeded to get offended as well and say that it was racist for me to talk in a derogatory way about white people. When I tried to explain that it wasn't the same thing, she cut me off and asked, "What is racism anyway?" I ended up getting another panic attack and walking out of her office. To summarize, she ignored any and all problems I could have been facing from being a newcomer to Canada and decided to treat my quote-unquote rebelliousness and mood instability with medication. This did not work out very well for me, as the root cause of my problem, which was racism and settlement issues, was causing me to have anxiety, depression, dissociation, mood instability, and many other labels. But the root cause, the settlement issues and racism, were never addressed. So I found other ways of coping, some good, some not so good. But thankfully, I left ESA, switched to a more diverse high school, and for my last 2 years, and thanks to the internet and new peers, I began to educate myself on race relations and understand what I had been experiencing. Unfortunately, my story is not unique or an isolated incident. Many newcomers to Canada struggle, to say the least, and our current mental health system in Toronto fails refugees and does more harm than good. The problem with our current mental health approach, which is based on the medical model, is that it views mental illness as something that is inherently wrong with the individual, whether that be a chemical imbalance in the brain or a genetic vulnerability. The idea is that the problem is within the person and nothing could have been done to prevent the illness. This ignores social factors that deeply affect one's mental health, like racism, colonialism, oppression, neoliberalism, and much more. Research done by Statistics Canada shows that newcomers arrive to Canada healthier and with better self-reported mental health status than those born here, but with time, their mental health greatly deteriorates. This should not be surprising. According to a study done in Toronto by Shakya, Kenlu, and Gonsalves, settlement issues like language barrier, isolation, adjusting to a new school system, and difficulty finding employment are a health issue, and racialized newcomers experience racism that leads to serious issues with their well-being and mental health. Social workers and healthcare practitioners have a significant impact on the well-being of refugees and their mental health, depending on the quality of care offered. Rather than immediately referring racialized refugees who are struggling with the settlement process to psychiatric services, they should start with newcomer services in their neighborhood that foster a sense of community and belonging. They would also need to include a vast amount of resources pertaining to housing, employment, education, childcare, language support, youth services, and mental health advocacy. Some centers that provide the resources mentioned include West Neighborhood House, Culture Link, Planned Parenthood Toronto, Costi, Parkdale Community Health Center, Polycultural Immigrant and Community Services, Access Alliance, Newcomer Women's Services Toronto, and many more. Healthcare workers should also engage with madness and MAD studies. MAD studies is a relatively new field of study that brings to the forefront the violence that people deemed as mad receive by the very systems claiming to help them, the psychiatric and healthcare systems. Additionally, it shifts the focus from an individual perspective to a social perspective. It looks at madness not as a diagnosis but as a political identity and a social movement. This knowledge comes from the community and not from academia. It is bottom up. In order for professionals to accordingly support refugees, they must attend to madness along with being hyper-aware of systemic and institutional racism and xenophobia. Attending to madness, quote, brings to the fore the erasure of voices and experiences of people deemed mad, the use of harmful and forced treatment and confinement, the practice of labeling people as biologically defective, and the effect of being governed by segregating laws that afford fewer rights by virtue of being labeled mad or insane. Joseph, 2017, page 242. Some healthcare practitioners are becoming aware of the harm their fields can do. Francis, 2012, the chair of the DSM-4 task force, warned psychiatrists to be cautious and skeptical when following the DSM-5 and diagnosing patients in order to avoid overdiagnosis and harmful overmedication. Quote, DSM-5 violates the most sacred and most frequently ignored tenet in medicine, first do no harm, end quote. In order to minimize harm, further research from a critical science paradigm that focuses on direct action via study results must be done. Critical social science paradigm. In response to the Statistics Canada study mentioned previously, the Government of Canada has approved a $2.2 million funding rate for 3 years towards a new newcomer program called Newcomers Health and Wellbeing, made by the Canadian Mental Health Association in partnership with other agencies and funded by the Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada. This program is meant to take a more holistic approach to mental health services to better meet the mental health needs of newcomers to Canada. However, although this program makes a brief mention on their website of how the settlement process can be traumatic, it also talks about individualized, culturally competent care, mainly offers to make psychiatric assessments and therapy more accessible, and repeatedly mentions the need for trauma-informed care due to the violence refugees could have experienced back home. It fails to mention why refugees have such unique mental health needs and how Canada as a society and its systems are implicit in causing these needs. It's not good enough to just say that refugees could have experienced violence back home that leads to trauma and fail to acknowledge that a lot of the trauma can happen once they immigrate and in Canada. Racialized refugees in Canada do have specific needs and problems that must be taken into account and addressed before anything else. The rippling effects of systemic violence and racism, colonialism, and xenophobia cannot be fixed through psychiatric medication or intervention. I know this first and foremost because of my personal experiences. Since the age of 10, I was set up to fail by the Canadian healthcare and school system, and I will not stop until change occurs. It is time for social workers and healthcare practitioners to sway from the Western biomedical model of mental health and dive into more holistic practices with the guidance of the service user. Mental health and wellness are political. The violence has to end. Thank you.